Everyone. Before we get started, I just want to remind the participants that this program is being recorded today. Along the way, if you have questions that were not already submitted, we ask that you type them into the Q&A. If you want to type your name into the chat as sort of a login or a sign-in that you were here. Neil Cohen will be monitoring the chat, and we will have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. And shortly after the conclusion of this webinar, once we have it all prepared, we will send out an FAQ that will include answers to questions that were asked in advance, as well as those typed into the chat today, and we'll get that out as soon as it's ready. So welcome. We're thrilled to have so many of you join us for this first joint webinar between the Office of the Inspector General and the Division of Local Services on an overview of municipal audits. We hope to offer more collaborative webinars in the future, and we're excited about this one today. My name is Debbie Wagner, and I'm the Director of Accounts at the Division of Local Services. I have been with DLS for almost 23 years, and I began my career here in the Education Audit Bureau, and have been with the Bureau of Accounts for about the last 21 years. I started my career in public accounting at KPMG and was an internal auditor at Bay State Health Systems doing departmental operational audits and internal control analysis. So have great familiarity with the subject matter today. And I'm also joined today by Neil Cohen and Maya French from the Office of the Inspector General. Neil is the Director of the Regulatory and Compliance Division of the Office of the Inspector General. He holds numerous professional certifications, including Certified Fraud Examiner, Certified Inspector General, and is a Massachusetts Certified Public Purchasing Official. Neil has more than 30 years of public sector experience, including 26 years with the Massachusetts Office of the Inspector General. And since 2018, has been managing the office's training and compliance functions. Previously, he co-managed the office's investigations division. Maya French, Esquire, is the Deputy Director of the Regulatory and Compliance Division at the Office of the Inspector General. Maya joined the office's legal division in 2012 as part of the Hinton Drug Laboratory Investigation Team, which won a 2014 Manuel Carballo Governor's Award for Excellence in Public Service. At the completion of the investigation, she joined the Regulatory and Compliance Division. In addition to investigatory and legal work for the office, Maya provides Chapter 30B guidance to local officials and oversees the office's Chapter 30B and procurement technical assistance function, and is the lead Chapter 30B attorney.
Hello.
Before joining the office, Maya spent several years as a town legislator, so she is one of all of you has been one of you public officials, where she reviewed and approved operating and capital budgets and advocated for local policies and changes in local regulations and bylaws. We are fortunate to have both of them here with us today. So welcome. This presentation will provide an overview on independent audits for municipalities, recommendations on selection of an individual auditor or account auditing firm, how auditors should be selected, and why audits are a valuable financial management tool. I'm going to share my screen now. So what is an independent audit? An independent audit, it's an examination of the entity's financial records, accounts, business transactions, accounting practices, and internal controls. The objective of a year-end external audit is obtaining assurance as to whether a community's year-end financial statements are presented fairly and in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP. Just to give you a little background on what GAAP is. GAAP's a set of accounting principles that are prescribed by the Financial Accounting Standards Boards. It ensures that there's a commonly accepted ways to record accounting information so that it's clear, consistent, and comparable. So that when people outside of an entity are looking at financial statements, they're able to compare financial statements among like entities And so when the auditors come, they perform various testing to get comfortable that financial statement balances are materially correct. Additionally, on this slide, we have a link to information on governmental audits that we think you'll find helpful. An audit report is an appraisal of the entity's complete financial status. Completed by an independent accounting professional, this document covers the community's assets and liabilities and presents the auditor's educated assessment of the community's financial position and future. The management letter, which will be described in more detail in this presentation, will contain comments and suggestions concerning auditing procedures and systems based upon the fieldwork completed by the auditor. Properly performed audits play a vital role in the public sector by helping preserve the integrity of the public finance functions and by maintaining citizens' confidence in their elected and appointed leaders. These audits can only be performed by a certified public accountant. It should also be noted that audits are public records, and it's also a best practice to have the report presented in public meeting by the auditing firm. One thing I want to point out here is that an audit is not protection against all things. I think people have the misconception that when they have a financial audit, it will detect fraud if fraud exists. And that's only true maybe and sometimes. It would maybe detect fraud if it falls into a materiality threshold or if it happens to end up in a sample size selected by the audit firm. So I just wanted to make that quick point.
And if I can add some commentary to that as well, Deb, that sometimes there's a misconception out there. I know that in my experience, sometimes whenever we approach a jurisdiction and we ask questions, or there's, unfortunately, there's a need to do or to begin an investigation, kind of the initial reaction that we get is typically, well, what do you mean? We got a clean audit. Like, why are you here if we got a clean audit? So it's to just reinforce what Deb is saying, that the auditing standards do not require, there's no expectation that the auditor detect fraud. That it's not a fraud audit. They have to be aware of fraud. They have to, of course, if they see it, they have to say it. They're supposed to peel away some of the layers if they detect something, but that is not what they're there to find. They do find it, but statistics show maybe about 10% of the time. So I wouldn't take that as like absolute assurance. And when you say I have a clean audit, I know we're going to get to that later in the presentation, and we are going to reinforce on future slides the notion of a CPA and using a CPA and the importance of that when we talk about procurement, and also presenting your report in public. Again, we'll probably emphasize that on future slides because it's, and I'll use an example later, but the notion that these audits, first of all, they're public records. And the reason that we do it is to ensure accountability and transparency. So as public officials, as members of governing bodies, we do have a responsibility to make sure that this information is given to those people who find it relevant, which is arguably our constituents. So I'll turn it back over to you, Deb.
So the question becomes, when do we have to have an audit? And so the current threshold under the Federal Single Audit Act requires that there be a financial audit or a program-specific audit whenever $750,000 or more in federal funds are expended during any one fiscal year. Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 44, Section 42 also requires that if a community has had an audit of its accounts or the accounts of separate departments, that the audit firms must file an audit and any recommendations with the Division of Local Services Director of Accounts. And we require that audit to come directly from the audit firms, not from the city, towns, or districts. I want to point out here, this is very important, and it may be on some of your minds with the recent disbursement of ARPA funds. The receipt of the FEMA, CARES, and ARPA funds over the past year may cause a municipality that's never had an audit required to require an audit because of the expenditure of more than $750,000 in federal funds. To be in compliance with continuing disclosure requirements with bondholders no later than 270 days after the fiscal year end, the audited financial statements need to be submitted to the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board or the United States Department of Agriculture, if applicable, under USDA loan programs. The Division of Local Services strongly encourages communities as a best practice to have independent audits performed by certified public accountants every year. We encourage those communities who do not have the financial resources to procure an audit annually to adopt a cycle where an audit is performed every 2 to 3 years, and additionally, an agreed upon procedures engagement of specific procedures in other years. So agreed upon procedures are a contract with your audit firm where both parties indicate what is going to be looked at instead of a full financial audit. You know, is it going to be a review of a certain department or certain transactions? But that is what agreed upon procedures are. The only entities that are required to have, other than those that meet the $750,000 threshold, regional school districts are required under Mass General Law, Chapter 71, Section 16A, to undergo an annual independent financial audit. Additionally, if a municipality comprises 10% or more of a regional district, or is otherwise committed to provide an annual disclosure, the municipality is considered an obligated person and must provide continuing disclosure information annually. Neil, I think we're at yours now.
Okay, thank you. So selecting the audit firm, and again, to really, I'm going to jump to the last bullet first for a second, contracting for audit services. When you begin this process, it's important to know that if you use CPA services, they're exempt under Chapter 30B, the Uniform Procurement Act. So local jurisdictions do not have to follow Chapter 30B to obtain the services of a CPA. And that's only if the CPA is conducting CPA-related functions. So you can't hire a CPA to, to do something else for you in town hall. It has to be specifically for generally accepted CPA work. So you have less of a hurdle to go through, fewer rules to follow, but it's still important that you use sound business practice. You follow a sound policy for choosing a firm. There's sometimes this misconception that because audits may not be important, or it's just something that you need to get through, that it doesn't really matter who I hire as long as somebody has a CPA next to their name. Well, it really does matter. You should make sure that, first of all, the firm or the individual that you hire is familiar with municipal accounting and municipal auditing, because it is a niche in the accounting world. You can't hire, a tax auditor to do your municipal audit and expect it to be done well. Not everything is translatable. So you have to still do your due diligence to make sure that the individual, the firm, the CPA, can do the work that you're requiring them to do. If you're not sure, if you happen to be in one of those situations where you've never had to do an audit before, and now you have to, or even if you're looking to go beyond doing a financial audit, because there are many different types of audits that you could do. You could do performance or operations audit. You can do IT audits if you fear, or have concerns about your IT infrastructure and its vulnerability to attacks, to cyber attacks. You can have a IT audit done. There are special engagements that you can hire a CPA firm for. So are these individuals qualified to do that specific work for you? If you're not sure, you can, the Mass CPA Society has a searchable database, or you can contact them directly. DLS also knows who does municipal auditing, because they get all the audit reports, so they can tell you who does them. And also, probably one of the best sources is just to contact your peers in other jurisdictions, because if you're not getting audited or you haven't hired an auditor, chances are your neighbor has, or someone who's not too far away. So it's very important that you do that due diligence up front. And I know one of the questions that somebody asked us before the training was whether or not you could use the same firm or the same individual to do multiple audits at the same time. And I guess the answer is, well, it depends. And you have to be very sure that there's no conflict of interest there. You don't necessarily want the audit firm auditing things that it already did or should have had purview over in one of their other engagements. So the answer is depends. I think we would advise people not to use the same firm, to separate things out, because the notion of independence, we can't stress enough the notion of independence and why that's so important for accountability and transparency for this process and for our jurisdictions. And if you can't ensure that, you undermine the process, basically. So I'll turn it over to you, Deb.
So transparency and independence sort of leads us into our next section of the presentation, selecting an audit firm and the role of an audit committee. Many municipalities establish audit committees to select an outside audit firm, and the Division of Local Services encourages the creation of an audit committee to be responsible for procuring audit services, determining in advance the audit's requirements and objectives, and selecting the eventual audit individual or firm. The committee should have direct contact with the audit and auditor and monitor the audit's progress. In general, local finance officials and the municipality's chief executive officer should be excluded from the audit committee and the independent auditor hiring process to avoid the potential for or appearance of conflict, since audits effectively reflect on their performance. And this is what I meant with regard to transparency and independence. If you have someone that is actually being part of the audit that they themselves are, or their performance is sort of under review, you don't want that person in charge of the audit process. So just kind of a little related story, when I worked at Bay State Health Systems and we did internal audit reviews, we often did effectiveness and efficiency audits and control analysis. But our department, our internal audit department, reported directly to the president of the health system and to the audit committee of the health system. And we issued all of our reports to those people. We didn't report up through a sort of the CFO or a finance branch of the health system. And that gave us complete independence and it made the process completely transparent, so that we weren't at risk of writing a report that maybe criticized some finance function, and then but then they would have the ability to review our performance. So it was a completely independent process. Members of the town finance committee or city council are potential candidates for this committee. Residents with appropriate work experience or professional backgrounds can also be valuable members of an audit committee. The committee should require an exit interview at the audit's completion and monitor the progress of local actions needed to correct any deficiencies cited in the audit report. The committee should participate in the audit presentation to the select board or city and town council. And usually the presentation of the audit report, we recommend that it be done at an open public meeting by the audit firms, as we mentioned previously. It's sort of the light of day principle that you want to be transparent with the citizens in your community about the findings of the audit report. And just it gives them confidence that no one's trying to hide anything and that this was an entirely above board and not just a perfunctory process.
Deb, if I can just step back to the prior slide for a second.
Yep.
We did have a question that came into the chat that that asked the question about whether it's a best practice to have the audit committee do the selection versus having, whether it's a mayor or the town manager hire it. And I think that this slide answers that question, that
Yep.
if you have an audit committee, it's probably the best practice to have the audit committee do the hiring, because it's, as you said, it's a matter of transparency and accountability. And as we mentioned on the prior slide, eliminating any potential, conflict of interest, because the audit firm will be looking at the work of staff and how well they're actually doing their jobs, keeping the books of the jurisdiction. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. That the other thing about creating an audit committee is, I guess, why not? Because if you think about all the other committees that we create in our jurisdictions, the reason we do that is because we want to segregate that work out, because we realize that either that policy or programmatic area is pretty important. And you need the people on that committee to bring a certain level of expertise, to have the time and resources to devote to that particular subject area. So we should think of audits as a subject area that needs that time and resource commitment and the expertise applied to it. So by creating an audit committee, you're elevating the importance of the audit. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not simply something that you're doing just to get through. It's not a root canal that, you just need to kind of sit back and, hopefully it'll be over soon. That's not really the intent of the audit. It's something that you should be doing because it's important to do, and you should look to take the findings or the information, good or bad, and reflect upon that and then convert it into something useful for your jurisdiction.
Okay, and I believe, Neil, this is you also.
Okay, so this question had also come up in the in not only today's chat, but in the pre-meeting, pre-training questions. How long do I engage my auditor for, my CPA for? And the Government Finance Officers Association, the GFOA, recommends a 5-year period. I think we would say that that's probably the outside, that 5 years is really should be the limit. And why would you want to do a multi-year contract anyway? I mean, you would want to do it because there's the notion of continuity, because sometimes the first time around, people are just learning how we do business. They're learning how our organizations work. So you want to be able to take advantage of that for the next time. It reduces the learning curve. And the point that we made earlier about even they may be able to see things more clearly year 2, year 3, things that they didn't necessarily notice in year 1. However, there's a flip side to that, because the old saying that, familiarity breeds contempt, that sometimes those relationships get too close and people get to know each other too well. And then there's a reluctance for them to be critical, especially when there's there's that contract situation. The jurisdiction is paying for a service, and the service provider, even though they have professional and ethical standards that they have to comply with, it's still a contract. They're still trying to please, the customer, who the person they're contracting with. So the notion of rotation is an important one, and you should not have a CPA firm for a very long period of time. It doesn't mean that you can't have the same firm back after you take a break and you engage someone else, but to have a continuum is problematic. It's a double-edged sword. The most extreme example that I've ever come across is there was one jurisdiction that I'm pretty sure had the same individual CPA. It wasn't a firm. It was literally the one-man CPA office in town doing their audits. I think it was close to 40 years. And then after that individual retired, people realized that a lot of those audits look like cut and paste audits from one year to the next. Even, the individual being a one-person operation, didn't even bother sometimes updating the information by changing the years or some of the other information. So those should be really red flags to the jurisdiction, that it might be time for a change. This is somebody that is, looking to extract the greatest profit from this engagement. So I think that's I think that was it for this slide.
So next we're going to talk about the audit report components. The auditor's role is to test and form an opinion on the accuracy and reliability of a municipality's year-end financial statements. And here I want to stress the word test. An audit doesn't look at 100% of all the transactions in your community. An audit will test 100% of all material transactions, depending on the test, over a certain dollar amount. And then we'll rely on a sample size to be representative of the rest of the population beyond that. So to think that an audit looks at 100% of your transactions is not correct. It's a testing environment. The auditor has obtained reasonable assurance that financial statements are free from material misstatements and in conformance with generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP, which we talked about before. And in the opinion, the auditor explains what was found during testing or measures that were applied during the audit. And there are 4 types of opinions that we'll cover next. An unmodified or clean opinion reflects the auditor's conclusions that the financial statements are fairly presented and comply with applicable financial reporting framework. That means that they didn't find anything that would give them any pause regarding the accuracy of the financial balances on the financial statements. A qualified opinion is issued when the financials are fairly presented with an exception of a specified area. And so that's where you'll see a statement that says, with something like, except for the following situation, the financial statements are materially correct. And then the most damaging is an adverse opinion, which is issued when the statements are misrepresented or misstated and do not accurately reflect the municipality's financial positions. And a disclaimer of opinion is issued when the auditor's opinion on the financial statements cannot be rendered because of limitations. So, for example, that would mean that the auditor was either denied or unable to access certain records, which would allow them to opine on the financial statements or a section of the financial statements. And so it's basically saying they're unable to offer an opinion, which is that, and that's what a disclaimer of opinion is.
So, Deb, I think an important note here is that anybody who gets one of these opinions, that they should really understand why they're getting anything but an unmodified opinion. And they need to, if they don't understand why, they need to ask why. And it's another reason to have an audit committee, because it's that independent view on this. It would be very easy for, if people in management in the jurisdiction really don't want to, they're afraid of the bad news, it can make them look bad. And they shouldn't feel that way, but it's human nature. So they may not look to peel away the layers to really fully understand why they didn't get the absolute clean bill of health. And that's what audits really are. They're like your annual medical checkup. You want the doctor to be able to say to you, you're great, you're healthy. But if you ask the doctor, how am I? And the doctor says, well, I've had healthier patients. And you're like, okay, good to know. And then you leave. You should have that little extra curiosity to say, uh-oh, why aren't you happy with the results of my checkup?
Another section of the audit that you'll have is with regard to the management letter. The management letter provides management or those in charge of governance with valuable information about their organization. The management letter is a list of internal control weaknesses and operating inefficiencies that warrants management's attention. It can also include things that you should know coming up for the future, like new standards that will impact you and your community, just kind of a heads up type of thing. A city or town's financial management team should provide written responses to every component and should outline a corrective action plan, including strengthening controls. So like any good plan for improvement, you should take the comment from the audit firm, develop the plan for remediation, and then who's responsible for implementing that change, and do a monitoring by timeline sort of process, so that everybody's on the same page and everybody understands who's responsible for that improvement or implementing that change. Once the results of an audit are received, local officials should work with the auditors to uncover the root issues of deficiencies flagged and work to mitigate them by directing the corrective action plan that I just spoke about. The community should resolve all identified problems as soon as possible as it strives to be a good steward of the public's resources and trust. In addition, the effectiveness of any new measures should also be measured periodically. As it's not automatically included as part of the audit, municipalities should be sure to include it in their engagement contract for the reasons stated above. And I think Neil touched on this a little bit before. It's the management letter isn't something that you should be afraid of, and you should look at as helpful management information that's only going to make your community stronger and more effective and have better controls over your resources. And it should really be viewed as a positive thing and not something to fear.
Right. I think I'm just going to speak anecdotally from my experience, and I don't want people to feel disappointed in me that I haven't been able to review all 351 audit reports every year for many years, so I apologize for that. But for the ones that I have looked at, unfortunately, again, some of this is just a knee-jerk reaction, or it's just human nature to, if somebody gives you bad news or you perceive it as bad news or criticism, your initial reaction is to go defensive. And some of the responses to the management letters seem to be like there's a fight with the auditor. And it really shouldn't be, because let's not forget, you just hired this audit firm. You're paying this audit firm, and you might have a legal obligation to have this audit done. So you should, as Deb said, it's information that is for you to use, and it's not for you to engage in combat with the audit firm because you disagree with them. It's okay to disagree if they didn't do a great job, or you feel they didn't look at everything they needed to look at, but you should have a more positive posture towards these recommendations, because they're not really doing it to play gotcha. I mean, they're working for you. So they're just telling you like it is. This is what they saw based on their expertise. And unfortunately, again, I've seen some jurisdictions where it's literally cut and paste findings in the management letter year after year after year, and the jurisdiction just ignores it or says something like, yeah, we'll get to it. And some of these things are significant. They wouldn't be in the management letter if they weren't significant. So for example, in one case, a real life case, for about 8 years in a row, the CPA firm put in there that there was a serious violation of internal controls in the treasurer's office of the jurisdiction. There was no segregation of duties, and the jurisdiction was just like, yeah, well, you know, what do you want us to do? Hire another person? We can't afford it. Well, but you need to figure out what you need to do, because it's just unacceptable for there to be these findings on a continual basis. And lo and behold, it took 8 years, but eventually there was an embezzlement in the treasurer's office that was uncovered. And then the jurisdiction was kind of shocked and appalled that this could be happening. It's like, well, you know, it's again going back to the annual medical exam. If every year you go for your annual checkup and the doctor says if you don't change your diet, you're going to have a heart attack, and then you have a heart attack, you know, you can't be surprised because you were warned every year that it had the potential for happening. And it really, like I said earlier, it undermines the intent of having the audit in the first place. There's a reason that we have these audits. And when I see the same management letters year after year after year, it reminds me of the quote from Albert Einstein when he said, look, you know, just repeating the same thing over and over again, trying to get a different result is the definition of insanity. So then we have to ask ourselves, why are we being insane when it comes to these audits?
I mean, you know, there's someone who used to work for the Division of Local Services that had a saying, and it loosely was, you know, rules are because of, you know, something bad that happened in the past, right? Or laws. And so, you know, this is the kind of thing where if your audit firm is telling you it's a material weakness, that your cash and receivables aren't being reconciled on a timely basis, you know, that's something to take seriously, because we do have no end of bad stories of things that have happened in communities. You know, I think it's something that internal controls especially are something that you can't take lightly. And there's no reason if you're in a select board, or if you're the town administrator, why, you know, you can't ask to see reconciliations. You know, if people are telling you they're being done, but, you know, you can every now and then ask to see the reconciliation of receivables or cash, and just make sure they're being done, because those are two of the most important things that you can do in a community. But again, when an audit firm mentions in the management letter that that's not happening, or other similar things, you know, it's really not something to be taken lightly, and we just can't emphasize that point enough. There are many benefits to an audit. The independent audit is a valuable management tool for assessing the fiscal performance of a community. If a community is experiencing financial distress, an audit can help reveal the underlying causes, which can be remediated timely. Infrequent or late audits can cause a city or town to base important financial decisions on inaccurate or outdated financial information. In addition, audited financial statements provide information that is critical during a credit agency review of the municipality's fiscal condition as it prepares to enter the bond market. Ultimately, the effective use of the audit and management letter recommendations can assist a community in improving its financial controls and practices. So just one little kind of story about accessing the bond market. You know, there are many small towns in the West that haven't had audits and were doing their broadband projects, and they really didn't have access to the bond market because they didn't have 3 years in a row of independent audits. And so that limited their ability to they were able to get State House notes and we're happy to help them in that way, but didn't have access to the actual bond market because of the absence of audited financial statements. So that concludes the presentation, and here we have links to both the Division of Local Services website and the Office of the Inspector General's website if you want further information about anything.
Debbie, it's Maya French here. I just wanted to mention that Glenn Cunha is participating today. He is in our attendee list and he wanted me to say hello on his behalf and just mention that we are delighted to have this partnership with DLS, and what we're discussing is really important and really valuable. And I think, you know, our office provides trainings on compliance with Massachusetts procurement laws. Management letters have mentioned violations of the Massachusetts procurement laws when there are problems. It's obviously a red flag and problematic, and I am in complete agreement with Neil. Like, if you need to be aware, go for your checkups, get information that might not be something that you want to hear, but a way to address problems that could be arising. So I want to invite everyone to go to our website, review the classes we offer, and sort of get their arms around one aspect of managing finances, and that's the spending of money as it relates to supplies, services, and real property that fall under Chapter 30B, as well as construction projects.
I also want to highlight for all of the attendees the Division of Local Services website, the data bank section. Our training portal offers no end of information that it could be valuable to your community in making financial decisions and providing training on various municipal finance concepts and other related issues. So please access our training portal and our data bank of information, our community dashboard. It's a tremendous resource and available out there for you all to access. If you have any specific questions, we encourage you to reach out to your Bureau of Accounts field representative or to myself at wagnerd@dor.state.ma.us, and I'm happy to get back to you on anything you have questions on.
Do we open, are we opening the floor now for questions? Or?
Sure, yep.
Okay. And if we're waiting for people to ask any questions, I mean, I don't know whether we should touch on some of the questions that might have been asked previously before the session. I don't know if that's.
So we, if you would like to ask a question, we ask you to type it into the chat, into the Q&A, I'm sorry. And then in the chat, if you haven't signed in, you can do that there.
So there is a question about asking us to explain what the single audit is. So I don't know if it was easiest to kind of go back to that slide or if you just want to present it.
I'll go back to the slide. So a single audit is an audit either specifically on multiple federal grants or program-specific audits, and it's an examination of the controls and processes around the proper expenditure of such a grant. I think that's the best and most brief way to describe it. It's the kind of thing that if you have multiple programs, multiple financial or federal programs that you're going to require to be audited, you should just have a full financial audit. If you have one small, very specific program, you can go ahead and do a program-specific audit. But otherwise, if you have multiple federal grants that cause you to fall into this threshold, it's probably just as effective to have a full financial audit.
I think what people should understand if they don't have a lot of experience doing auditing or going beyond the annual financial audit is that, and again, I don't know why I'm fixated on the medical analogy today of, but even if you go do your annual checkup, sometimes the doctor will say to you, okay, you need to go for an x-ray or you need to go for a blood test or other types of testing. Well, if we think of the single audit or your annual audit as the main checkup, now if there are things that need to be followed up on, then you can engage either the same CPA firm or a different CPA or CPA firm to do additional type of auditing for you. A number of people asked about forensic audits. So if there's an indication in your financial audit, your annual audit, that perhaps there's something going on, then you might seek to hire a forensic audit firm that is their job then to identify fraud and look for where the schemes might be occurring. If you just need a performance review, let's say there's a finding in the management letter that one of your departments is just really is not doing a great job, at least from a financial standpoint, there might be a reason for it, that you might have a firm come in or an individual to do a performance audit to try to get to the bottom. You're trying to diagnose why there's a problem. It's hard sometimes to diagnose the problem from a one-time, annual commitment where somebody comes in either for a few days or a few weeks. It's sometimes very hard to diagnose that problem given the scope of what they're coming in to do.
Somebody asked, they're curious if an audit would review or investigate the incoming revenue to a municipality and tie it out to the approved operating budget. Some audit firms tie your budgeted revenue amounts and budgeted appropriation amounts to the tax rate recap that you fill out for the Division of Local Services and setting your tax rate. But with budgeted revenues and also budgeted expenditures, variances, budget to actual revenues and budget to actual expenditures is a management function that you should be performing on a routine basis, looking at what you estimated for revenues versus what you collect and what you budgeted for appropriations versus what you're spending. That's something that's really a management function of the city, town, or district to perform, and not the audit firm. But the audit firm sometimes ties out what you budgeted to what you submitted for the tax rate for setting up your tax rate with the division.
There were two other questions. I can answer one, and then the other one I'll turn to you because it's related to GAAP. So one question was about what financial documents are subject to public records. And I guess the short answer to that question is all of your records are subject to the public records law unless there's a specific exemption for that record. So your best course of action is to consult with your records access officer that every jurisdiction is legally required to have. It's typically your municipal clerk but it could be your legal counsel. And if you do not have one, or they don't know the answer, then you could always contact the Secretary of State's office, and specifically the Public Records Division, and they could answer your question. But as a general rule, you should assume anything that's in your possession is a public record unless there's some restriction on it. And the next one, do you see the next one, Deb?
I see the question from Leslie Ann in Mount Washington. Hi, Leslie Ann.
Oh, there's one above that about gap accounting.
Okay, let me do the one from Leslie Ann. So, hi, and I would say to you, Leslie's question is, we're a very small town. We welcome and need and want an audit, but don't know who would be best for our small town. Their annual budget is less than $1 million. So I would look at communities that are similarly sized to you and see who they use and how they feel about those firms. We typically don't recommend particular audit firms, but I would look at similarly sized community and reach out to them and see who their audit firm is, and if they're, if they feel like they're getting a good product, and go from there. So hope that's helpful. Curious about. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Neil.
I was going to say they could also, the town can also just do some solicitation,
Right.
do a procurement solicitation, even though it's an exempt service. If you don't know who to use or who to go to, then just put it out publicly, just like any service, and see who responds. And you would just craft it, letting them know that you're a small jurisdiction and this is what you're looking for. So if it's a firm that doesn't want to have your contract because you're too small, then maybe you'll figure out who does want to do business with you.
This question, it says, curious about gap accounting versus Mass Municipal Finance Law. It says, for example, our auditors are responsible for Mass Municipal Finance Law, such as special revenue funds that requires benefits associated with a full-time employee to also be applied to the fund. Another example, the Mass Municipal Finance Law requires 50% of boat excise tax to be allocated to a special revenue. If this is not happening, would an auditor required to backdate and adjust the financial statements to meet GAAP and Mass Municipal Finance Law? I'm not sure when you refer to Mass Municipal Finance Law what you're referring to, and I guess I also don't think it's accurate that 50% of the boat excise tax be allocated to a special revenue fund, although I could be wrong, but I don't think so. I guess I'm not sure really what that question is asking. You would have to contact your audit firm directly if you're having an audit and ask them those questions. Generally speaking, an audit firm will recommend audit adjustments if you don't have something recorded in the proper period, or they'll make reclassification suggestions if, for example, you have something posted to an incorrect account. Those are some of the types of audit adjustments that you'll see. But I would on this specific question, I would reach out to your audit firm because I'm kind of not really sure what is being asked. Let's look at some of the questions that were submitted before. There was a question related to contract bidding and award, audit issues related to PO issuances and standing contract terms or renewals, audit issues related to contract terms, and that doesn't really have to do with the scope of this presentation. Again, there was a question, we are looking to get bids from firms on our annual audit. Do you have a list of accounting firms that specialize in this? I can give you a list of the firms that submit to us financial audits in municipalities in the Commonwealth. So we can probably post that somewhere. And I can send out an email to the participants about that.
There's also on the slide, we mentioned the Mass CPA Society.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
then another thing is we had mentioned just reaching out to your peers. So if you are a school district and you're a school business official or business manager belongs to MASBO, they could reach out through the listserv and ask who does your audits, and then you might get a response that way. Or if you're a municipality, you can go through MAPO, the Procurement Association, and do the same thing. Just do the listserv outreach and just ask who does your audits, and you might be able to compile an interesting list that way.
This is an ambitious question, and it says, is there any help or resources that address how to create an internal control framework and implement our own audit and testing procedures that can be relied on by external auditors during their reviews? And they're concerned about catching issues in real time. And so applause for being ambitious and wanting to undertake something like that. If you have the time, that's great. With regard to the part about whether this testing that you do can be relied on by your external auditors during their reviews, that's an audit firm question, and you should ask them about that. But there's all kinds of internal control guidance out on the web about internal control frameworks, internal controls around specific functions like cash management and receipts. One good resource is COSO, which is the Committee on Sponsoring Organizations, and they promulgate various internal control structures. So if you were to Google search COSO, the other day when I saw this question myself, I did do a Google search on internal control framework in government entities or municipalities, and other states have some information that they've published on that kind of thing. And so applause to you if you actually are going to do some of this sort of internal audit work yourself. I think that's great. And yeah, another question, how do we efficiently prepare for the audit? Your audit firm will love you for this. Ask your CPA firms. A lot of times they'll provide for you before the audit a list of documents that they're going to want to see. They will sometimes provide for you a list of schedules to be, we used to call it PBC, prepared by client. So reach out to your audit firm and ask them what you can do to prepare for your audit, what documents they're going to want to examine, have those ready to go. It saves everybody a lot of time if you have a nice conference table with some labeled piles of things that they may have asked for in their list of schedules that they require. So that's great. So that's how you can help them. And again, somebody asked, are audits meant to uncover fraud should it exist? And you know, we've seen all kinds of things that have happened across the Commonwealth that are absolutely appalling and horrifying, and audits didn't catch them. And it's because when you're doing an audit, you're doing a financial statement audit. You're basically verifying, the audit firm is basically verifying the balances on the balance sheet and doing analysis on the revenues and expenditures to determine whether those seem reasonable compared to prior years. But unless you point them in a direction where you say, you know, we think something may be going on in the treasurer's office or the collector's office, and we have people coming in and telling us that they've already paid their bill, but you know, they're still getting a demand. What, you know, why is that? Unless you have a suspicion about something happening somewhere, and like I said previously, unless the fraud is falling into a particular materiality threshold or happens to fall into a sample size selection of transactions to be reviewed by the audit firm, because remember, they don't review 100% of transactions. They'll do, 100% of all transactions over $1 million. I'm making up a number. And then a stratified sample, maybe a certain number of transactions under and a certain number of transactions over a certain dollar amount. And that's how they do their sample size. So unless the fraud happens to be a transaction that they're testing, and even then it may not be something that they're looking at. You have to remember that the purpose of the audit is to get comfortable that the balances and the financial statements are materially correct. Looking for fraud is an entirely different kind of audit. Just like an operational audit is a different kind of audit. An operational audit is a review of the efficiency and effectiveness of the operations of, generally speaking, a particular department and the control points in that department. What things are there to safeguard the assets of that department? What are you doing to protect cash as you collect it and make sure that that it's properly recorded and that kind of thing. So, different audits are designed, as Neil said before, different audits are designed to catch different types of things, and not all audits are going to catch fraud. Neil, I don't know if you want to say anything else on that.
No, I agree, and we can't necessarily have complete and total expectation that an audit does everything, because it doesn't. It's just based on the scope of what we're providing, and the auditors will follow whatever standards they need to adhere to, because you are paying them, so they have to fit what they're doing within the fee that you're paying them. And again, using the medical analogy is kind of a good one. There are specialties and specializations, and you can't expect one provider that you go to give you the answers about everything, because they'll tend to say, well, you need to go see this specialist or that specialist. It's the same thing in auditing. You're not going to find an individual, and it's unlikely that you will find a firm, unless it's one of the big, like the big four firms that can do everything. So you're going to need to seek it out. Two things I want to, Tim Bell, thank you for the correction on the boat excise. So Mass General Law does require that 50% of boat excise be credited to a municipal waterways fund, and I'm not sure if the audit firms do look at that. And then this is an important one. This was asked before today's session. Anything particular required for auditing these federal COVID grants? I'm interested in any guidance and preparation tips you might be able to share relative to the federal single audit required due to COVID relief funds received by my community. That is a definite ask your audit firm question, because they'll be receiving guidance on how they should be auditing these federal funds. I would say that one of the important things to ask them is, what level of detail do they want you to maintain records on how you spent these grants? And one thing I will say is document, because the new ARPA funds go out all the way to 2026 by the time you can expend them for a capital project, 24 otherwise. But and by then you may not be in your position. People there are now won't maybe be in the same position. And so you have to make sure that whoever's doing your job at that point in time can provide detailed records of how the funds were spent. I think it remains to be seen what level of detail these are audited. But reach out to your audit firms, because they can advise you on what level of detail they want you to keep in your ledger and what documentation you should keep about how the funds were spent. If you're saying that
putting in a new air handler is related to the COVID emergency, we'll document why you think that. Other capital improvements maybe that you do, this is more for CARES funds, but because the ARPA funds seem to have broad ability to be used, but document why you think your expenditure of those funds was tied to the emergency in some way. If you're paying someone with some of these funds, you know, why you think that what they did was related to the emergency. So that's my best advice on those kinds of things. And I think that's all of the questions in the chat.
Yeah, I don't see anything else, and you know, I think you covered the majority of the questions between the presentation and this Q&A session. I think we've covered the high points of the questions.
So for the rest of you that are still here, we appreciate your coming and look forward to doing more joint presentations in the future, and hope you found this to be a valuable resource to you. So thank you very much. And thank you, Neil and Maya, for being with us today. This was a great presentation. There
was one question earlier about whether DLS was going to distribute the PowerPoint, or if you're going to be posting the video or the recording of this. So I don't know if you wanted to speak to that now.
So we recorded today's session, and our intention is that it be posted on our website, probably in our training portal. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, Deb, Jennifer, Frank, Maya, and the many people who attended.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.